Normally, Sri Lanka is known for stunning beaches. You have architecture, ruins, you have great wildlife diving sites. But Sri Lanka is also known for disasters. They
Yes.
had a lot of civil war and tsunamis. And at one point, you're thinking to yourself, where does one disaster stop and the other starts, right?
Right.
So, Donnie, thank you for talking to me. I heard your talk about leadership.
Yeah.
And you had a lot of lessons from how you built a EMS system in Sri Lanka. So you lived through all of these catastrophes. So I would like to talk to you about this cascading effect of these disasters and what comes with.
Good.
Welcome, Donnie.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit.
Yes. Well, it's great to be here with you and have this conversation. So my name's Donnie, and I've been a paramedic now for over 30 years. Had the chance to work in many, many countries, including just under a decade in Sri Lanka. Currently in the United States and in a leadership role there, trying to help really unite EMS operations between different states and different organizations. But it's great to be here and have this conversation with you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, if we think about risks that you're taking, you don't only see medical risk, you also see safety risks, security risks. So how do you prioritize or mitigate these risks that you're seeing in an environment like Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so Sri Lanka at the time, and it's been almost 20 years now, which is tough to really comprehend, but, a complex disaster. And so, sometimes we respond into be a singular type of a disaster. Yeah. So, when we think about Sri Lanka almost 20 years ago for me, the unique thing there is it's a complex disaster. So you have stacks of different types of disasters happening simultaneously. In Sri Lanka, you had the tsunami combined with the conflict zone. And then on top of that, you had even other stacks of disaster. You had political changes, political turmoil going on. And that's not too uncommon for people responding to austere environments today. Complex disasters are around. So how do we manage these different risks? The very first thing is, as a leader, it's important to just step back and be aware of the risk. You can't mitigate what you're not aware of. So making sure that you're looking at the different layers, and you have to look at the layers through the different lenses as well. So as an expat, I had one set of risk. We had common risk, but we had also unique risk of being an expat. And then you have to look at it through the lens of not only local, but in Sri Lanka and in many countries, especially at the time, you had different ethnic complexities or different religious complexities, and you have to look at the risk through those factors as well. So understand the risk, and then once you understand it, you can start mitigating, you can start making smart choices. Now, in these environments, you can never fully eliminate the risk. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, makes absolutely sense because as a leader, you also have responsible for a team, right? Which was quite diverse. I think you've been the only American. Everyone else comes from different places,
Right.
different backgrounds, also different educations, I guess.
Yes.
So depending on which level of society you come from, I guess you also face different risks of being in that type of situation.
And, in addition to the physical risk or the situational risk, you also have to think about the emotional risk and the psychological risk. I went from Sri Lanka to Haiti, and, one of the things that was unique is I asked for the team who was preparing my supplies for Haiti to actually get some playing cards and some frisbees. And they were lightweight, and they said, what are you talking about? It's like, no, I need some distractors. I need some fun, something that allows our team to decompress. And so really thinking about the emotional, physical, security risk altogether.
Yeah. Yeah, I think keeping the moral high is also a priority, right?
Yes.
Otherwise, you have the tension within the team, which you can't really have if you're in a crisis situation. Yeah. how do you see the trickle down effect? Like, I think we see it in Sri Lanka also, but especially in a place like Haiti, where you say, okay, you have the disaster, everything is destroyed. Then people are in the conflicts among each other, maybe robbing, stuff like that. You have maybe diseases. So what type or what comes from what, or can you even distinguish what follows out of a catastrophe like a natural disaster?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens, more so in Haiti in this example, is whatever is the norm of the day before the catastrophic event happens is going to be amplified. So, many would say Haiti was in a failed state or failed status or slipping status. You had criminal activity, gang activity, unrest going on. And then you add the disaster on that. And it's like adding a magnifying glass.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, in the Haiti earthquake response, the aid workers became targeted very quick. And so the gang activity, the lawlessness doesn't stop necessarily because of a disaster. It just gets amplified. And so that created a security risk for personnel. So I think that's part of the effect that can happen. It's like a crucible. You add pressure into the situation and it's going to amplify that.
Okay. What type of casualties are you seeing in this crisis environment? Because I could imagine if there's already like the conflict where you see a certain type of casualties, then you have the flooding. Like,
Yep.
well, who's coming to your hospital and what do you need to treat?
Yes. Well, so I think in both, the experience in Sri Lanka and in Haiti, it's important to remember you're going to get the spectrum. And so immediately after the event, so in Haiti, you had a moment in time earthquake. So obviously you're going to have, trauma, you're going to have crush injuries, you're going to have orthopedic injuries, you're going to have everything related to the earthquake. But that's a relatively short period of time. Same thing in a conflict zone. You may have the blast injuries or the gunshot wounds, but when we are talking about complex disasters, these don't just resolve in a matter of days or weeks. And so what happens soon thereafter is you have people who don't have access to routine medical care. And so the people with chronic health conditions are now without meds, without treatment. And so you have the surge in, diabetes. You have the surge in, your uncontrolled hypertension patients. And then on top of that, you're going to have your everyday routine emergencies not only continue, but probably be amplified. So you have your heart attacks, you have your strokes, you have your childbirths, you have your complicated childbirths. And so in these situations, you really have to be prepared to handle all of these. And then when you have an environment where you have a displaced populace that comes together, now your chance of infectious disease is now amplified. So from a medical perspective, as you're responding to these complex disasters, you always have to be thinking about the acute, but also the chronic and then the infectious disease. And at some point, a comprehensive response, you're going to have to also be thinking about how do you reinstitute things like preventive healthcare, especially in many of these environments, even today globally, these complex disaster situations, they can be measured in years, not days.
When would you say we can go back to normal, if that's even a possibility, as we are talking about time right now? When is it disaster response? When is it like help for development? And when can we say, okay, we're going back to normal?
Yeah, I don't know that there's any predictive timing for that. Every disaster is going to be unique, but you certainly have the acute phase that's going to happen with a new type of an event, and so we have the response, and then at some point you're going to hopefully shift into a recovery phase. Now that recovery phase is what's really unknown, and you're going to have complex situations, and I think about Syria, for example. I mean, you can have a recovery phase that goes on many, many, many years. Sri Lanka, after the end of the conflict, was able to pivot relatively quickly. I mean, in the context of the scale of the operation, they pivoted, probably in 1 year to 18 months through that, immediate recovery. And then you get into like long-term recovery. And some would say maybe that's still going on even 15, 20 years later. But, it's that pivot. But that time period is going to be different in every disaster.
Okay.
I think about Haiti, the earthquake was in 2010. And, for many purposes, they still may be in a hyperacute phase. And because you keep on having new insult upon new insult, certainly the 2010 earthquake 15 years ago is quasi resolved,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have that recovery phase because it never happened.
Oh, yeah. Especially Haiti. There was, like you said, there was a conflict before,
Yep.
right? Disaster strike, and they're still in this conflict. So, yeah, like you're saying, the disaster phase maybe is over, but the conflicts they had before, they're of course not resolved.
Yep.
Even though they're not in like the disaster, like a natural disaster state, they're in a disaster state.
It's a repetitive hyperacute disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just new insults come frequently.
Especially if we start to look further into Haiti, like you are on the ground as paramedic helping people. How do you navigate your own safety versus patient treatment? Because I could imagine it's very tense. Like you said, there's kidnapping potential in Haiti, diseases, assault, robberies. So how do you navigate this?
Very challenging. Haiti was one of the most actually difficult deployments I was on. So I had team member deaths, and that was very unfortunate. We had to evacuate more of the rescue teams from Haiti than any other conflict I've worked, and it was a combination. I mean, so we were having aftershocks and we were having boating collapse, and we had injuries from that. The physical environment was very, very difficult. So, even something like, climbing through rubble, but you have broken bones and of your responders, right? So you have those situations that happened. And then we had the disease aspect, so, they had the mosquito-borne diseases and dengue, and that unfortunately even contributed to loss of life of the team. So navigating all those things was incredibly complicated. And then the mental health aspect of it is very important as well. So for the team, so as a leader, try to, again, identify the risk, mitigate what you can, but also give space for the team. And I mean, I remember multiple times where, the team would be in our tent and be preparing to go, and a team member would just, tell me, I just can't go today. Okay, don't go today. What can we do to help? So I think those things are important to understand from a leadership perspective. Plan for that and have mitigated the best you can. One of the things that we try to do is take people out for R&R. And that's very important in these situations. Maybe it's every 2 weeks, maybe it's every 3 weeks. If you possibly can, pull your team out, allow them to spend a few days outside the disaster, reconnect, and then come back in.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Because I sometimes, I could imagine it's hard to distinguish between, okay, this is very uncomfortable. We don't have electricity, aircon, water, whatever. So it's uncomfortable, obviously. But when does it pivot to being unsafe and we need to react on this? Like, is there a line or is it?
It's fluid.
Yeah, it's fluid.
It's fluid. And the concept of what is safe versus unsafe. I think about you accept the baseline risk, right? And so, like for instance, going into Haiti, here's a baseline risk. And there's not a whole lot I can do about that baseline. But then I look at the graduation, the risk stratification that changes from that baseline. So for instance, we would be getting intel on maybe there's gang activity along this one particular route. Okay, well, we're not going to take that route today, right? So, and maybe it means that you cancel medical clinics or you don't resupply a hospital, and you pivot from that. So those are some of the mitigation things that you would do. Being tied into that disaster response community is very important for that. Being able to rapidly share information.
Yeah, makes sense. How much time do you have prior to deployment? Like, is there a time window? How much can you even prepare for that situation?
Yeah, it really depends on the disaster. So in Haiti, it was essentially no time. You had this massive earthquake that happened, similar with the tsunami. Now, I came months after the tsunami, so I had time to prepare. But Haiti was an immediate response, and we have responders today that go to disaster events, and it's very little or no notice. Even today, I'm still part of a disaster response team. And so I've got my go bag ready. And so, I've got to be able to deploy within 24 hours. So if there's a disaster in the United States, I would respond within 24 hours. And so, sometimes you don't have that time, which means that you do your preparation in advance. I don't know what the disaster may be that I would get, called to next week, but I've got the core elements prepared.
Okay. What would you say surprised you? Like, you do your planning,
Yeah.
you know kind of what you're getting yourself into. So what are like the surprise moments that you had?
Oh boy. I love that question, and my mind goes to maybe less profound things, but like I go back to Haiti on this one and think about we knew there was going to be problems with food and shelter and lodging, and you make your plan for the immediate deployment, but then you have to figure out something quick, and so we had a large team, and so we had to figure out a better strategy for food.
Mm.
I remember one day I wanted to understand the process of getting food. And so I rode with the team down to the market, and they filled our SUV full of live chickens, and so,
Oh, no.
yeah. So, like here I am sitting in, the SUV with like 15 chickens in there, and, walking and, making it, being a chicken. And, that was, that was our dinner, for the next couple of days.
That's
And it was great to have chickens, but, like I hadn't thought about that or prepared for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's going with the flow.
Yeah.
When you could not prepare
Yeah.
for something like that.
But I think from a leadership perspective, if you have time in a disaster to at least look into different parts of the supply chain and understand. We pivoted from, the rations we brought in to be able to get, some locally, but I wanted to understand that process and of providing the chickens. But it's important as a leader, if you have the opportunity, to try to understand the realities. And then what I was able to see is the absolute genius problem solving that our team members had implemented. And that repeated for how we ended up with like generators and electricity and basic supply chain. So from a leadership perspective, seeing that was phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that sounds great. And maybe it's even more important to have like problem solving skills than being the best educated paramedic.
Well, that's a key point as well. In these complex disasters, whatever your plan is, it's just not going to work. Because every disaster is going to be different. You're going to have so many moving pieces, but you have to have you have to surround yourself with team members who are able to be master problem solving. They're able to improvise. They're able to make decisions based on imperfect and incomplete information, and then being willing to pivot frequently. And you have to make sure that your team has the trust in the leadership to follow those pivots.
Okay. How do you establish this trust?
Yeah. I part of it is good communication. So, communicate with your team, make sure they understand the realities of the situation. So that's important. I think the next is having a leader with a proven track record. In a disaster, everyone's going to make bad decisions at some point. But you have to have more positive decisions than bad decisions. And so I think as you do that, your team, not only your immediate team, but the team that may have came and left, but there's still cross communication that's going to happen, and they'll say, hey, yeah, this will be a tough disaster, but Donnie, Bob, Jane, whoever is in charge, you can trust them. They're going to make good decisions. So I think that's established over time and experience as well. And
Mhm.
and again, own your mistakes. In a disaster, and I shared a story in the previous conversation we had in Haiti of where we, airlifted a container of medical supplies that ended up not being medical supplies. And in leadership, it'd be very simple to be frustrated with someone down the chain of command. In a disaster, it's so important to recognize, no, we trade speed for information sometimes. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to own that at the high level. And I think that's how you build that trust as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. What would you say is like the main difference working in that environment compared to the US? I mean, we touched a lot of topic, but what would you say like that's definitely like black and white and two worlds?
Oh boy. Uh, predictability.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably the number one thing. In our everyday jobs, there's a lot that's predictable. But in a disaster environment, nothing's predictable. Everything's going to be changing and fluid. So I think that's it. But it's beyond that, beyond predictability, I think it also comes down to resilience,
Mhm.
and having a shared purpose. In these disaster and deployment situations in austere medicine, uh, I really see people do amazing, extraordinary things. And in your everyday non-emergency life, occasionally people just do something extraordinary. But in a disaster response, I see absolute extraordinary every day,
Mhm.
multiple times a day. Uh, People do things that would have seemed impossible before. So I think that's some of the differences.
Mhm.
Uh, the trade-off is we know that's not sustainable. So, I can't ask people in a routine, normal environment to operate at that hyper level because they're going to get burned out and that doesn't work either. But there's a balance there.
Yeah. I think also the difference between like if you go on your normal shift, like in the US, after that you go home to your family, right? You
Yes.
have your dinner with your family, with your friends. You go out, have some fun. That's not really possible in like emergency situation, right? You just sleep for
Yes.
going back to work.
You sleep, but one of the things that I have learned in the different disasters I've responded on is, yeah, you don't necessarily fully unplug, but it's so important as soon as possible to establish some type of a routine. So, I think about, in Haiti, we would come together and play cards and throw the frisbee and try to do something that was disconnected. You almost establish your own little bubble zone. Now for us in the initial days it was the few tents that we had together, and then later we ended up into a bit of a compound office space. In Sri Lanka, we had a house that we would go to and you could decompress. So I think those things are important.
Yeah.
But boy, it's very different than, just going back to your home and your family and your routine. Because you do have that kind of on switch, off switch, in a routine that you don't have in a disaster.
No, I could imagine. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
what would you suggest someone who would like to go into your type of work? What shall they do? Study? Be mentally prepared for?
You know, let me take the study one first. I think the key is find an area of expertise that you have a passion in. And, many of those areas, if maybe not everything, can be used in a disaster. We're surrounded by artwork here, and I'm looking at that, and I'm reminded of art therapists in the disaster zone. So, people may not think about like a degree in art. How can I ever use that in disaster? But I've seen it used, and it really works. So, from the study side, study what you're passionate about and become an expert in it. And I think that's important. In a disaster, you really do need experts. That's not the place to go for, hey, I'm a young intern, I don't know much. Boy, that's probably not the right thing. But become an expert, and if you are an expert in the field, you could probably have some utility in the disaster, if not in the hyperacute phase, at other phases. Certainly, medical professionals and logistics professionals are in the hyperacute phase. So I think that's number one. And I think the next thing is, if you want to get into the work, resolve to do it. And I hear people who say, "Oh, I want to get into disaster." Well, what steps have you taken? And it usually involves sometimes even volunteering in the beginning. And so when I put together a disaster team, or when I used to put together disaster teams, per se, I'm not looking for someone who's never had an international deployment, because I need to make sure that, if we're going to go in on this first wave of disaster, that you understand what it's like in a high stress, high risk foreign deployment. So how do you get that experience? Well, maybe not on the hyperacute phase, but during a disaster, volunteer to go in, get some time, and get some prolonged time. There's a 2 week, 3 months, 6 month, 1 year kind of like hash marks that I've seen. Maybe there's some research out there. I should probably look and see into it. But what I've learned is that at these marks, people deal with crisis inflections. And so, because when you are in for 1 week, all of a sudden something gets more real, a couple months, then 3 months, 6 months, I see a big inflection point. And, so get the time. And then after you have established, oh, yeah, I can adapt, I can survive, I can take care of myself, then the opportunities abound.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone who wants to read more about Donnie, you wrote some books about leadership, EMS systems. I will drop it all in the comment section or in the show notes, so that people can learn more about you, about what you're doing as a leader, as a paramedic. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's been an honor.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye bye.